I have a pretty new battery here, so I suspect that my alternator's bad. So inside the truck, I've got this battery warning light that won't go away. I'm gonna show you how to test that. If you have a digital multimeter, that's the easiest way to check it. I've got it set on voltage here, and when I check the battery without the car running, I'm 12.12, 12.13, which is a little bit low for a battery, but it should get the truck started. So we'll go ahead and start the truck, and with the alternators charging the battery, it should be a much higher voltage, 13 volts, 13.5 volts even. So we'll see what it does here. Truck's running now. I'm getting less than 12 volts, 11.94, which makes sense because some of the lights on the dash and whatnot are drawing some power from the battery. The battery's not getting charged by the alternator, so I've got a bad alternator. The first step is to disconnect your battery. So we're going to disconnect this black or the negative battery wire that goes to your battery here. So just get an 8mm wrench or socket and loosen that up. Once it's loose, just disconnect it. Tuck that wire out of the way where it can't make contact with your battery post. Okay, the alternator's right up top, so we're going to go ahead and remove this air inlet assembly and this little shield that goes on top of the engine here. So let's pull that shield off. I've got a 10mm ratchet here. I'm just going to get the two bolts on this side off and the one on the other side off. All right, there's a single clamp up here on top. It's a flathead screwdriver, or you can use a socket. Go ahead and get that removed. In addition to that, there's two hoses right here on the right side. We'll take those two hoses off. There's also two wires on this inlet housing. There's one right here where you can see it, and then there's one on the bottom underneath the air filter here. All right, that should give us enough room to pull this out. So pull that off. I'm gonna go ahead and undo this clamp where the air filter sits and just disconnect it there. Be a good time to change the air filter anyway. I'm just gonna move this whole assembly off to the side and leave that connected. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and pull the belt off the alternator. There is a belt tensioner just below the alternator. You'll need a 1/2-inch breaker bar to put into that tensioner and release the tension on the belt. There we go. Now go ahead and release that tension and get the belt off. Okay, belt's off. Now we're going to disconnect the top main wire that comes into your alternator. Let's try to pull that rubber boot off. And you'll see a brass stud underneath of it. And go ahead and get that brass nut removed. Shouldn't be that tight. Don't lose the hardware. Okay, now that I have that main power wire disconnected here with the 10mm nut off of there and the wire off, there's two more wires on the right side of the alternator. There we go. So I was able to press a small flat screwdriver in that slot on the back side of the connector and kind of release it from the little tab at the bottom of the plug. Now this one on the right side is similar. The connector has a little plastic retainer on the forward side of the connector, so if you can get a little screwdriver on the forward side, front side of the connector and kind of pry that little keeper off of the tab, the connector will pull right off. There you go. This is what I'm talking about. You can see that I put my screwdriver right underneath of that little keeper or little retainer clip and just pried it apart a little bit, and it came right off. Okay, I don't have the greatest lighting ever, but I wanted to show you the alternator bolts that hold the alternator onto the engine. There's a couple of bolts you need to remove on the bottom, one right there, and the one just to the left, right there. So we're gonna try to get those couple of bolts removed. They're 10mm bolts. I'll do my best here to break this one free. It's not all that tight. That one's already loose. We'll try this one here. Make sure it's on there good and solid. Break it free. Once it's loose enough, you can use your fingers to kind of remove those bolts. All right, I'm just removing the bolt. Don't drop it. Get that other bottom one off all the way. Let me try a ratchet wrench, might be a little easier. Okay, there's only one more bolt holding the alternator on, and it's on the top. There's a little bracket here. You want to remove the bolt that's closer to the alternator right there. That way the bracket kind of stays with the engine. All right, we're going to remove this bolt here, this 10mm I showed you. You might need to support the alternator. It'll start to get loose. This is the last bolt holding it on. There we go, I pulled my bolt out. Now we can kind of figure out the best way to pull this alternator out. It's pretty much straight up. When you go to the parts store, it's a good idea to bring your old alternator in there with you just to compare it with the new one. Make sure it's exact like for like. Make sure your electrical plugs are exactly the same. Look at your new alternator. Even though it's new or rebuilt, make sure that the connectors and the little tabs on the connectors are intact and not broken off. I've had a new one before that was actually already broken. Make sure you have the hardware that you need. Make sure your pulley has the same number of grooves in it. This is a 6-groove pulley. They do make a different one with 8 grooves. So just make sure it's a like for like on your new alternator. We need to fit our replacement alternator back into position. Make sure you have it so the pulley is forward. Make sure you have it to where the electrical connectors are on top, and we'll go ahead and hold it down into place and then try to get that top bolt started to hold it into place. My top bolt's started. Make sure you don't start it crooked. If it's too tight, it's probably crooked. Don't get it super tight because you still need to be able to get those bottom bolts started. Let's get those 2 bottom bolts started. They should be pretty close, but you can move your alternator around a little bit until the bolts go into where they should go. And you should be able to find it, get it in the position to where the bolts will start pretty easily. I think they're started. Now you can take your socket or your ratchet wrench or whatever you have and get those bolts snugged up. I'm going to use a ratchet wrench at first just because it's a little easier. Now that all 3 bolts are snug a little bit, I'm going to go ahead and torque them down here. I'm just going to get them kind of snug. I'm not going to use a torque wrench. You're tightening against the alternator housing. Alternator housing is not very strong, so that's why you don't need to torque it very much. This top one snug. Okay, now we're going to get that belt back on. So I've already got my breaker bar down in there on the belt tensioner, and I can loosen up the tension on the belt with this breaker bar. And other than that, you just need to look down there Make sure your belt's on the pulleys that it should be on. And get ready to put it on your alternator. So when you're ready, release the tension, slip it over the pulley on the alternator. And then let go of the tension on the breaker bar, and that's it. Let's get that bar out of there. We're gonna go ahead and attach our electrical connectors. So your new alternator probably came with a new nut on the positive wire stud. So let's go ahead and remove that nut. Don't drop it down in there. Might be a good idea to remove this before you put the alternator in. That way you can't drop it down in there. Now grab your wire harness and route it to where it goes. Let's go ahead and make those connections, put those plugs back on. There you go, you probably heard that snap on into place. They're both in position. Now we can put this terminal back on here, get our new nut, and get it started on the stud. It's a 12 millimeter. You don't need to torque it very much. It's just an electrical stud. I would call it a one finger torque. Put your thumb on the ratchet and snug it up. And that's about it. Now slide that rubber boot back over the connection. And now all your electrical is back into place. Now we can go ahead and get our air inlet back into position. We're going to fit the engine side on first. Just goes right over that inlet. And now on the air filter side, it's pretty self-explanatory. It's kind of idiot proof. It only goes on one way here. So once you're satisfied that that's on there good, go ahead and lock your clamp back down. On this side, you've got one wire connector over here. We'll get that back in place. Now you have these two hoses on the right side that we removed. Let's go ahead and press those back into place. Now we'll go ahead and tighten up this clamp here. Finally, we can install this protective cover back over the engine here. All right, now let's reconnect that negative battery terminal. It's an 8 millimeter. All right, we're all done. Now theoretically, when we start the truck up and measure this voltage that's coming into the battery here, or at the battery, it should be above 13 volts, and that'll tell us the alternator is charging. We've got 13.28, 0.29, 13.3 volts. I'd say we fixed the alternator problem. It's now getting more volts than we had before, and it's definitely charging. Hopefully watching this video gave you all some confidence to tackle this job yourself, and thanks for watching. Follow me for more useful tips and videos. Thanks.